Now, for more on the making of and efforts to close America's wealth gap, I'm joined by Nicholas Pearce. He's a clinical professor of management and organizations at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rachelle.
So I want to start by getting your thoughts on President Biden's plan announced in Tulsa today. Is it bold enough, and what are the chances that some version of this actually gets off the ground?
Well, it's important that President Biden was the first sitting president to acknowledge the ugly truth of what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago. And such moments of truth-telling are essential steps toward reconciliation, but they are insufficient. Proclamations of this sort are really important, but I would say we need to watch who's going to profit off of all this proclamation and apologizing for what happened in Tulsa. And thus far, the early evidence suggests that it's not the people who were harmed.
So then talk about some of the ways that the U.S. wealth gap between races has developed and continues to show up in U.S. history.
The wealth gap is this seemingly impenetrable force that explains so much of why systemic racism is what it is. It is this acknowledgement that try as you might, there's going to be a disparity on average between white families and black families in terms of their accumulated wealth that they're passing down from generation to generation. And the challenging thing, especially in conjunction with the commemoration of the massacre in Tulsa in 1921, is that these were black people who had done all the right things. They had amassed wealth and had that wealth stolen from them. So much of the conversation has to do with slavery and how wealth was prevented from being built in the first place. But in Tulsa, you had black families who had actually built wealth and had it stolen from them without accountability right under their noses.
So then let's look at how that's translated then into future generations. Have we seen any sort of significant improvement when it comes to the wealth gap over, say, the past few generations?
Actually, surprisingly, perhaps, things are actually looking a little bit worse. The wealth gap for black millennials is much, much starker than when you're looking at white millennials. In large measure, this is due to the fact that the upward mobility pathway in the black community for decades has been education. Education has been long seen as the passport to opportunity, yet higher education is increasingly costly. So black millennials are far more likely to have student loan debt and a greater load of student loan debt than their white millennial counterparts. Add to that coming out of school in a recession, add to that delaying marriage and the amassing of family wealth, and now you see why many black millennials are in more difficult shape than their white millennial counterparts or even their black foreparents from a previous generation at that same age.
And you mentioned the crisis. I mean, you have the 2000 financial crisis, this current pandemic. It really did show how easily it is for a person or a family to lose everything financially. What is the best way to accumulate wealth in the U.S. today? Because it used to be home ownership. Is that still the case?
Home ownership remains critically important, as does access to capital for entrepreneurship. What we have seen in this pandemic is an insanely large number of entrepreneurs struggling, and then the PPP loans open access to capital for many of these businesses to stay afloat, for many families to be able to stay in their homes. But if you're a black millennial entrepreneur who has an idea, but you don't have the same access to capital or startup funds, now you are behind the eight ball, so to speak. So this challenge is continuing to persist, and I hope that through some of the interventions that President Biden proposed, that we will see true progress. But a lot of people, as you know, Rachelle, have been making promises over the last year. Some have delivered, some are delivering, some have not quite materialized. And so we can only hope the best, that what President Biden promised today will translate into intergenerational progress in years to come.
Now, I want to quickly just touch on discussions around reparations. We've seen California launching a reparations task force. Some individual organizations have received some forms of reparation payments from descendants of slaveholders, but it's still very piecemeal. How much action are we seeing on this, and what sort of options are there out there?
Well, first is the reality that reparations is not a universally embraced concept. Yet, interestingly, for many of the detractors who would cite their religion or their faith as a reason for their political position, even Jesus in the scriptures talks about reparation as a necessary and important step. So the idea here is quite broad. First, we need to align on the fact that wealth, opportunity have been systemically stolen. And it wasn't just in Tulsa in 1921. You'll see probably in 2023 commemoration of what happened down in Rosewood in Florida. This is not an isolated incident. So we see this reparation conversation needing to take place, and it needs to encompass housing, it needs to encompass education, it needs to encompass economic development with no strings attached.